Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Birkbeck. I'm David Feldman, the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. One of the perks of this job is that one gets to be able to invite people who one wants to meet, and that's exactly what I've done this evening, having only known Jen Evans as a face on a screen in a Zoom call when I heard she was coming to England. I immediately sort of snaffled the opportunity to get her to speak here at Birkbeck. Jen Evans is Professor of History at Carleton University in Ontario. She's a historian of authoritarianism, of populism, of fascism, of love, of hate, of sexuality, and she's the winner of numerous awards, honours, and fellowships. She is co-curator of the neo-fascism syllabus, an extraordinary and essential weblog on fascist, authoritarian and populist movements and governments in the 20th and 21st centuries. If you don't know it, I recommend it to you. Her first book was called Love Among the Ruins, Cityscape and Sexuality in Cold War Berlin. And more recently, she's the author of Queer Life After Fascism, Kinship and the Queer Art of History, published by Duke University Press last year. She's also writing on Holocaust memory and on erotic photography. And this evening, she will be speaking to, as you can see, the ties that bind, kinship, adjacency, and the trans camera. Jen, I'm delighted you're here.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That's a really warm introduction, and I'm so glad to see folks found their way, despite some of the hurdles and changes. So this is a really nice event for me, made even more special because I'm going to be speaking to you about two very extraordinary women, photographers, and my way into this material was made possible by somebody who's in the room today, one of the archivist curators of the Lisetta Carmi exhibitions, who's worked with her archives. So this is an extraordinary happening, and we're all going to benefit from that immensely. I'd like to thank Jan Davison, Naomi Smith, and David Feldman for the invitation to speak to you all today and for making all of the arrangements for this evening. I'd also like to thank two of my colleagues, Alessio Ponzio and Federica Cavazzuti, who've shared their insights and their thoughts with me on Lisetta Carmi in the spirit of collegiality. So what I'm going to present to you this evening is new work from the book I'm currently working on, which revolves around photography and the sexual revolution. It builds off my recent monograph, The Queer Art of History, Queer Kinship After Fascism, in several different ways. One is the theme of kinship that I'll come back to at several points in the conversation tonight. But another is the argument about the importance of analyzing and writing histories of sexuality differently, through a different register, and that would be an aesthetic one. For my work, that means photography. Instead of the overabundant emphasis on sexological, social movement, legal, and medical frameworks that have a fairly strong place in the field. I argue in my book that this has perhaps narrowed what we see in the past, and especially who we see as historical actors. So photography, for me, opens the aperture more widely, and it brings us into the world of images. Simply put, it lends a different focus. So in my book, I talk about recognizing the ways in which we are situated in relation to those in the past. Our ancestors, in a sense, both the good and the bad kin, people whose stories, for better for worse, lend insight into the dilemmas of our own time. I draw on the work of Indigenous feminist Kim Tallbear to explain this, but other folks a bit closer to the field of Holocaust and genocide studies have been working with concepts like these for some time, too, in slightly different ways. Irene Kakandas explored this in her recent volume on being adjacent to historical violence, the product of a series of Zoom sessions early on in the pandemic that drew together over 30 participants from the world of German studies, Holocaust studies, but also people working on slavery and colonialism, as well as race. The aim was to think about ways one might, in Kakandas's words, create connections between histories that are often kept separate, figuring out reparative gestures and making room for shared futures. Some of the people in this volume, Mark Roseman, Mariana Hirsch, Leo Spitzer, Susanna Heschel, Doris Berggren, are known to folks in the room that work on Holocaust studies. Their work is central to Holocaust gender and memory studies. What is fascinating about their contributions are the ways in which they nudge us to consider the multiple and different ways, to use Michael Rothberg's term, we are all implicated in the histories we are telling. We're situated, adjacent, or in some cases, very directly, amidst forms of violence, past and ongoing. There's been a great deal of ink spilled these last years on how to think about these questions, how to find empathy across our differences, how to memorialize genocide and mass violence, and about our ability, in Susan Sontag's words, to understand the pain of others without minimizing or relativizing their suffering or our own. It's not for nothing that the folks thinking about empathy, kinship, adjacency, and historical violence often come from fields where the aftermath of these ruptures are very much still being felt: the history of slavery, the history of the Holocaust, the history of colonialism. So in my talk for you tonight, I'm going to present to you two examples of people who fostered what we might call adjacency, thought about this way, as a kind of kinship with people whose lives and experiences were vastly different than their own. I want to think about the absent presence in their stories, something that they don't always fully articulate in words, but rather through deeds, and which stems from, among other things, their experience as victims of the Nazis, as child refugees, and as women living in two extremely patriarchal societies. Though half a world apart, both were connected to past and ongoing histories of race, of nationalism, of violence. And I'm going to argue that photographs that they took of the sex worker and trans scenes in Genoa, Italy, and São Paulo, Brazil, represent an opportunity to see this theme of being adjacent to histories of violence and choosing to use one's platform, as we'd say today, to stake a claim to wider societal change through the humanization of others in pictures. And while this is certainly a history of violence and suffering, it's also one of joy. And my book is really trying to make an intervention in the histories of sexuality by not underplaying the fact that there's structural racism and violence, in our world, and that was the case years ago, but that we've forgotten that we also need to tell stories of joy. And so I'm always trying to kind of find that when I look to the past. So that's a little bit of my motivation. When we tell the story of the queer and trans past, we often begin in Berlin. And it isn't hard to understand why. It was there in the 1920s that the Jewish communist physician Magnus Hirschfeld and his famed Institute for Sexual Research played a vital role in sustaining queer and trans life in the city. Hirschfeld is particularly famous for testifying before a parliamentary committee to repeal the anti-sodomy paragraph, and for coining the term transvestite for the medical condition of gender dysphoria. The Institute also bestowed trans passes, or Transvestitenscheine, to allow persons to go about their business in their preferred gender, since it was illegal to dress in the opposite identity to which one was assigned at birth. Although it's important to know that not everybody availed themselves of this service. There's of course more to his story, including his eugenic thinking and his own racism, which challenges the romantic ways in which this history has been remembered. Most recently in the 2023 Netflix documentary, maybe some of you have seen it, El Dorado, Everything the Nazis Hated. And here it's interesting that in the service of telling the story of Hirschfeld's Berlin, the filmmakers remembered one aspect of the story, and not the most obvious, that the Nazis hated the Jews most of all. But that's for another time. Given the through lines that might be drawn between Hirschfeld and American sex researchers like Harry Benjamin and Alfred Kinsey in the post-war period, the men shared friendships, they shared research, even patience. We're similarly tempted to write the transnational history of trans lives and loves through sexology and medicalization. But what if all this time that we've been looking to Germany in the 1920s and the US in the 1950s, we've overlooked that there are tons of examples of trans world-making beyond the clinic. Our focus on sexology as a lens into the queer and trans past has inadvertently led us to reproduce photography's clinical disposition as well, including its role as a tool of measurement and of documentation. In doing so, we fail to recognize the camera's more reflexive working, including its potential to change not only the way photographers saw and understood trans life, but how trans people themselves understood their own lives through images. Looking to a different style of photography, we can enact what Tina Kempt has called a photograph's countergravity, a force so powerful it can shift the focus away from the medical gaze of looking at trans folks as objects towards a shared humanistic way of looking along with and alongside trans people. As we'll see here, a trans camera, one that promotes the shared experience of looking in kinship with the subjects photographed, changes what and how we see the trans past and the kinds of relationships that helped make it visible to us. One of those things we see is that the 1950s and 60s already, there was a wave of interest in cross-dressing, in drag, in what was then termed transvestism, sometimes hidden in plain sight. From Pittsburgh to Cape Town, gender nonconformism earned the attention of several photographers, many of whom stemmed from minority communities themselves. And in my talk tonight, I'm going to focus on two of them. Both middle-aged women when they picked up the camera, both Jewish, and this is what I think is super unique about this story. In Italy in the 1960s and 70s, in Argentina and Brazil in the late 60s, 70s, Lisetta Carmi and Madalena Schwarz explored the ways in which the camera might serve as a medium of kinship and solidarity after World War II. Carmi and Schwarz cultivated close, years-long, intimate friendships with those they photographed, many of whom worked as queer and trans sex workers in the city's brothels, or in the service and entertainment industry as hairstylists, servers, tailors, and performers in neighborhood drag scenes. Each in their own unique style documented the rich tapestry of experience of those on the margins of their respective societies. In doing so, they created new social and visual models of attachment and relatability for the mainstream as well, though their what we know about them and the sort of widespread story of them is something that's much later to be told, that surfaced much later. That this might occur in places of grinding surveillance, of state repression, of dictatorship, in the case of Brazil, is a reminder that liberation and liberalization must be thought about more critically and capaciously, free from assumptions we might have about where change happens. So in this part of the book, I'm trying to make arguments that it's not New York, it's not San Francisco necessarily, that change sometimes, if we open our lens a little bit wider, we'll see that change was already happening in other places, far from perhaps where we imagined. It's hard to imagine what would bring together a young pianist and dock workers from the port of Genoa. It was June 1960, and the city was rocked by riots. Demonstrators had taken to the streets to protest the inclusion of a neo-fascist party, the Italian social movement, in a coalition cobbled together by Prime Minister Fernando Tambroni of the Christian Democratic Party. They hoped to hold their convention in the city. What they didn't realize was that they were in the presence of history. As the students and workers moved from the rally grounds to the Piazza di Ferrari, they passed a monument to the partisans killed opposing Mussolini's regime. Emboldened, or perhaps angered at the taunting of the ranks of carabinieri and police, they hurled insults and possibly projectiles, and the order to charge was given, sending the well-apportioned anti-riot squad, many of them with right-wing sympathies, into the crowd. A melee unfolded, protesters fled or were pursued, and at least according to lore, the Genoese threw household items out of their windows onto the heads of the waiting police. That June, Lisetta Carmi stopped her lessons. She was no stranger to fascism. She had studied piano after dropping out of school in 1938 with the introduction of Italy's racial laws. Born into an insular, some might say severe Jewish family, she studied music before forced to flee for Switzerland on foot in 1943 as conditions for Jews rapidly deteriorated. Conservatory was her lifeline. It gave her life meaning and purpose. It also prepared her well enough that she enjoyed some renown as a performer in the post-war years. When her piano teacher warned that participation in the demonstrations might injure her hands, for her the answer was obvious. She took to the streets, she joined the strike, and she abandoned her formal performing career, although we'll see in a second that she didn't give it up completely. It was also the same year that she picked up the camera. In an accompanying piece for the 2023 retrospective, her lifelong friend and overseer of her estate, Giovanni Battista Martini, remarked how alongside images of the Jewish catacombs in the ancient Roman city of Venosa and its small community of San Nicandro Jews, the dock workers were the subject of some of her first photographs. Carmi had already made incursions into the port as a youth in the company of her older brother, who created artistic programming for the workers in the Ital Seder foundry. Once there, she befriended the men and returned once a month to perform music in their canteen. Gaining their trust, she secured access to some of the most harrowing parts of the port, which she photographed at the suggestion of the manager of the Genoa Culture Society to shed light onto the plight of workers there. The results were breathtaking. Images of men at work in stevedores, hoisting bundles on and off shifts with ropes and pulleys, often shoeless, forced to tie newspapers to their feet to work. Those who didn't have overalls wore rags unloaded from ships. There was the worker with shovel, naked from the waist up like a classical statue, resting amidst the powder-filled hold in a small mound of phosphorus. And there were photos taken in the darkness, the image's only light source, the cracking glimmer of molten steel. Although they were published as part of a report on working conditions, there was something ethereal about these early photos. Amidst the sweat and the stench, she managed to capture the solemnity, the grace, and the beauty of work under the harshest of conditions. Her photography was not just social critique. Thanks to connections in the local art scene, again through her brother, she expanded her network to include artists and architects, actors and playwrights. She also photographed for the theater. In 1966, a chance encounter with Ezra Pound resulted, I had an extra slide that I added, so here's just a nice image that you'll see soon of the Jewish Quarter in Genoa. In a chance encounter with Ezra Pound, she took 12 hastily snapped impromptu frames of film, one of which won her the Italian version of the Niepce Prize. Umberto Eco gave the laudation, saying that her images of the poet say more than has ever been written about him. So she has this gift with image making, able to capture an essence of those that she photographs. And this is being remarked upon already. As with the longshoremen and mill workers, somehow Carmi managed to capture his complexity and his extraordinary character in the literal blink of an eye. I wonder if this is the actual photo. No, it's not. So I won't even tempt you with the photo that I thought I had lined up. Already in these early photographic encounters, we see evidence of Carmi's visual humanitarianism, what we might call her adjacency. Hers was a practice informed by history and by a politics of reciprocity, which art historian and curator Roberto La Carbonara says manifested in her landmark amphibious dual look. From early on, he argued, Carmi placed herself on the threshold between us and them, between what seems alien and what seems familiar. Perhaps it was owed to her own experience of being an outsider as a Jew and a woman in a world of men, at a time when Italian intellectuals of various stripes, from the bizarrely homoerotic mysticism of right-leaning Julius Evola to activists like Marco Miele, associated with Fiore, the Unitarian Revolutionary Homosexual Front, which had come together in 1971 in Milan to put the question of Italian and same-sex desire on the agenda amidst rising neo-fascism. Indeed, she would claim in an interview in 2007 that she was always on the side of those who suffer. Her experience of anti-Semitism was perhaps a galvanizing force, but so too was her sense of inner turmoil around her own gender identification. I lived feeling different from others and connected to a people who suffered and fought for freedom. Like the gay liberation activists who sought a space for desire free from the stranglehold of societal expectations around gender and sexuality, Carmi placed the focus of her lens on bodies, on work, and on freedom to reclaim the power of individuality, of expression, and identity. In this way, her photography is imbued with the zeitgeist of the period, as Italy navigated a course through the raucous and revolutionary post-war years, with one foot in debates around the creeping authoritarianism of parties, institutions, and state structures, and another amidst an internationalist spirit of 1968 and the movements spawned in its wake. Many of Carmi's early photographs reflect this ability to move between worlds, transcending the limitations placed upon her as a middle-class Jewish woman, and finding solidarity across what still might be cavernous divides of gender and class. She was guided in this effort by her own moral compass to document the lives of those in the shadows, people without access to technology and social networks. She used her skill with the camera to bear witness for a world which she felt was no longer capable of seeing people. Using the camera to help bring into view the humanity of people's precarity, Carmi extended the reach of photography, bathing lives born of sweat and obscurity in beautiful light, giving them sophistication, depth, and meaning. Nowhere was this more pronounced than in the photo she took of Genoa's trans sex workers, just a few city blocks away from the port. And that's where I think I have this photo of a map from 1905 to give you a sense of the port. And I'm going to be talking about a very specific part, not too far from the dock workers that she also documented. Nowhere is this more pronounced than in the photo she took of the trans sex workers just a few city blocks away from the port, in the meandering streets and alleyways of the old medieval Jewish ghetto. And you get a sense from this map of the kind of small, narrow pathways, and you can see in this photo as well some of these small, tiny little crevices and pathways. If the summer of 1960 marked the beginning of her political awakening, it was the lightness of a New Year's Eve party in 1965 that formed the backdrop of what would become a 7-year partnership with the travestiti of Genoa. Homosexuality was legalized in 1890 in Italy, and efforts to recriminalize it during the Salo Republic failed. The 1930 law code introduced by Mussolini's Minister of Justice remained in force after the execution of Il Duce, but they did not refer to homosexuality explicitly, though aberrant forms of masculinity and desire flew in the face of fascist definitions of the new man, and men suspected of harboring same-sex attraction were institutionalized in an array of facilities, from insane asylums to prisons. As with Nazi Germany's treatment of lesbians and trans persons not explicitly targeted by law, there were other mechanisms for dealing with gender and sexual transgression. In the post-war period, the reach of Catholic morality, even after the reforms of Vatican II, together with civic authorities' glib use of residency laws, meant that lesbian, gay, and trans identities remained on the fringes. cross-dressing in public would only be legalized in 1981. Unlike Paris and even occupied and divided Berlin, which boasted a number of clubs drawing queer and trans performers and clientele, there was no public space where one might live freely and unfettered. There was no equivalent to Coccinelle in Rome, as in Paris, which as early as 1947 drew female impersonators to its stage from as far away as Argentina and Brazil, and a few years later from the newly created and embattled Jewish state of Israel. Without these nodes in the nascent drag and trans scene, one would think trans people in the city of Genoa would be shunted entirely to the margins. That was Ezra Pound. We don't need to see him. We'll skip him. Yet while many of the travestiti earned a living in the sex trade, they carved out a life for themselves in the private apartments, streets, and stoops of the medieval Jewish quarter. Now in her 40s, with 5 years of semi-professional photography under her belt, Carmi moved to a flat on the Piazza Fossatello, on the edge of the ancient ghetto. Eager to ring in the new year, her friend Mauro, and I'm so sorry, Italian is not one of my languages, Marco Gasparini, invited her to a party nearby. When they entered the apartment, they were struck by its petty bourgeois style, replete with sumptuous, if fraying wallpaper, turntable, and crystal glassware. Their hosts for the evening were two elegantly made-up women, dressed in sequins and wigs. Carmi soon became embroiled in conversation with them, and followed up soon after. In the subtle photographs she came to take of her new friends, in their homes, sometimes quick snaps in their intimates, or preparing to go out, other times posed alongside reproductions of classic paintings, or in the streets, hanging out. Her friend and the executor of her estate, Martini, sees the care and deliberation of her knowing eye. None of these things happened by chance. Carmi cast one vision of Italy with its bourgeois styles and sensibility against another that lived on its own terms, in harmony, if alongside. In the photograph of Audrey, posed in a bright red jumper, leaning against a sideboard, we see the angular beauty of a woman looking askance, while a portrait of a child by Mannerist Florentine painter Bronzino returns the viewer's gaze. We notice Audrey's body alignment with the porcelain figurine to the right of her shoulder. The frame itself, an archway of a door, is ornately carved, maybe even busy like the jumble of objects and artifacts in the shot. There is movement in this photograph, both in the clash of timescapes represented in the artwork and fashion, and the jaunty bit of midriff betrayed by the open button and the slight fold of cloth. Is it a playful reenactment of a scene or hastily posed sensuousness? We can't know for sure. What we do know is that for Carmi, these special stolen moments with friends in their apartments, as they readied themselves for an evening out, were the products of cherished personal connections cultivated between the photographer and her subject. Carmi recalled participating in their problems, sometimes serving as an intermediary between them and their foreign clientele. Her photographs were acts of adjacency and kinship, an extension of love and feeling across their many differences, snapped from a place of implication and of knowing. Carmi built bonds of trust, affection, and understanding that allowed her to do this work. But this relationship was not solely motivated by altruism. There may have been something existential about it for Carmi as well. On the one hand, certainly she hoped her photography might serve political ends as a challenge to enriched right-leaning patriarchal values and norms. From the wonderful work that has been generated about her by these exhibitions, it seems she had a clear sense already in her early days that photographing the old tombs of the monumental cemetery of Stegliano, of the corrosive workings of female dependency, embodied in the gravestones by images of fearful women dependent on men, that she had this sensibility early on. In a video interview at the 2023 UK retrospective, she recognized the time-honored struggle many trans people continue to face today. It took courage to do what they do, she said, and to face the often dramatic and violent consequences. Many of them have no alternative for employment. As men, they look too feminine. As women, they run into the obstacle of being listed as male on their ID. They must deal with incredible loneliness because society both seeks them out and isolates them, forcing them to live in what are basically ghettos. On the other hand, these images were very much about her own personal quest to reconcile what gender identity meant in her own life, where masculinity and femininity seemed equally fluid. When I was little, I would look at my brothers and long to be a boy like them. Hinting at her own hidden life or her own complex life, she averred, I knew I would never marry and couldn't accept the role that was expected of women. Like the numerous images of mirror reflections in this series in her photographs, which did not escape the eye of star psychoanalyst of the extra-parliamentary left, Elvio Facinelli, whom the publisher that finally picked up the photo book plunked into the volume's introduction, Carmi felt drawn to this issue because her friends reflected back on her a tension she perhaps felt within herself, perhaps on an unconscious level, between male and female identification, what it means to be a Jew, and of violent unbelonging. By living among the trans population in Genoa, in the vestiges of the Genoese Jewish ghetto, every day she saw evidence of the instability of gender norms, where despite the authoritarian tradition we are taught since childhood, again echoing New Left language at the time, all that is masculine may also be feminine, and vice versa. It's not surprising to hear Carmi speak of her practice in this way. The discourse at the time was still governed by discourses of degeneracy. Between 1968 and 69, the Cassazione, the highest judiciary authority in the land, still claimed it was a crime for a man to appear in public dressed as a woman. Even though it was becoming commonplace in Europe and in the United States, in 1975, a surgeon was tried for conducting a sex change operation, and the law authorizing gender-affirming care would only come to pass much later. Before then, it was common, even for progressives, to view cross-dressers as sick men in need of treatment. Though in 1972, Italy witnessed the first mobilization against this idea, when scores of protesters, many of them part of the early gay rights movement, descended on the Rome meeting of the International Congress on Sexual Deviance, hosted by the Center for Italian Sexology. And indeed, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, first compiled in 1952, to unify and standardize diagnostic treatment of psychological conditions globally, viewed transvedic fetishism as the result of a lifelong dysfunctional personality disorder. It wasn't until 1980, and the revision of the handbook, that it was redefined as a paraphilia. In a passage in the Milanese journal L'Erba Voglio, a laboratory of ideas for the student, feminist, and workers' movements, Facinelli called Carmi's images of travestiti in Genoa scandalous, both for the way the photos challenged polite society, but also the way they depicted life within the frame. And he means scandalous in a variety of different ways, not just in the one that might come to mind. A co-organizer of the Counter Congress in Rome in the summer of 1969 against the International Psychoanalytic Association to usher in an anti-establishment psychology of dissent, Facinelli was a towering figure in the intellectual circles of the time. With echoes of Herbert Marcuse's critique of capitalist society in mind, he no doubt saw the stripped wallpaper and gold lame trousers in Carmi's photographs as metaphors of a once opulent, collapsing society. The publishing house that reprinted his piece in the photo book must have believed attaching Facinelli's name to Carmi's work would give it a kind of power among the anti-establishment left, critical of Italy's institutions. And indeed, his praise was high, noting that we would search in vain in psychoanalytic texts for a trace of the richness of approaches and motivations that Lisetta's photos allow us to glimpse. Yet it was Carmi, in her artist statement, who pulled no punches, seeing in the trans women of the piazza society's own image refracted back again. I think the opinion we express about other persons is always an opinion about ourselves. We bear inside what we dread in the others, and we always try to defend ourselves by injuring that part we refuse. it would be a half century before the wider world would come to know of Carmi's photographs. The photo book was ultimately printed, but struggled to sell. Some booksellers flat out refused to shelve it. It disappeared almost as quickly as it came on scene, although there are very interesting stories about how this photo book how the last remaining copies of this photo book were actually kept, and so that's a story for later. It wasn't until the 2000s that retrospectives were organized in Turin and Rome and eventually in the UK a year after the artist's death. Let's see. She moved on to other things as well. She traveled the globe and continued to take up the cause of the marginal, including, interestingly, images from the Holy Land. And that's the one right here. She studied Hebrew in anticipation of multiple visits to Israel, first traveling there in the 1950s as a pianist and then as a photographer. She partook of cultural exchanges, played in Haifa and Tel Aviv, but also toured several kibbutzim. She went again after the Six-Day War in 1967, which left her unsettled ever after. In preparation for the Rome Museum's exhibition in 2017, her confidant Martini made a surprise discovery. In her home in Sisternino, in a desk long forgotten, he uncovered several Kodak slides from the Genoa project. Taken at the same time as her black and white photos, these images included some of the same subjects: Mina, Elena, Stefania, Roberta, Adriana, Laura, Audrey, Kabiria, Dalida, and Novia, in similar situations as before. Carmi had alternated at the time between her Leica, her Nikon, and Rolleiflex cameras, taking images in both formats. Color was the language of fashion photography, black and white, the domain of photojournalism and high art. And yet it was common for photographers to play with both forms in their practice, if not in publication. Simply put, color worked differently. And as we can see in these sumptuous images, they also create different associations and different feelings in us. And we see sort of ourselves more in color photos, right? They feel more contemporary as opposed to black and white, which seem more historical and archival. With a nod to the amateur vernacular snapshots, they create a closeness between the photographer and the viewer, sometimes lending an elegiac or romantic mood. Presaging the new color movement's acceptance of color film and print materials over the technical precision and artistry of darkroom development, Carmi's color photographs have more of a mise-en-scène and documentary feel. And there is playfulness too, and not just suffering. And I love these ones especially for the way in which you really see the sort of spontaneity of these images. The gaze mixes together the mundane and the everyday, and sometimes a little bit of erotic expectation. Hidden in some of them is Carmi herself, refracted back through double exposure. Among the many things attested to in these images is access to hormone treatment, a sign of subcultural ingenuity as girls had to find sympathetic physicians or travel to Paris or North Africa, where performers in the drag scene had access to the Casablanca clinic run by gynecologist George Beru, known for performing over 3,000 sex reassignment surgeries by 1973. I have to tell you that all of my images, based on my text, are completely now out of sync, and so I am sort of just winging it a little bit up here. So hopefully this all makes sense. Thanks to Martini's efforts, the color compositions were published in 2022 with commentaries by local journalists, friends, and Carmi's last reflections before passing. One of those voices was that of Juliette Jacques, a young British trans woman filmmaker and journalist, whose reflections on Carmi speak to the yearning for trans representation that continues to the present day. Jacques spoke of the contribution of Carmi in warm, personal tones, noting her refusal to show the trademark before and after sequences of sexology, and how this choice to show transness in its fullest iteration creates instead a living, breathing, joyous world of possibility. I wish I had known about the transvestites when I was younger, because it would have made me more aware of the fact that people like me existed in the world and in history. In the brief conversation they were able to have over the phone, the two affirmed the power of photography for creating a new visual language, perhaps more powerful than the written word, for the way these images communicated the humanity of these women without having to resort to descriptions of their choices and maybe even their identity. Carmi had the intuition to resort to the intrinsic capacity of photography to implicate us all in the lives and worlds of these women. And so this is a picture of Carmi just before she passed away. Meanwhile, halfway across the globe, another middle-aged Jewish woman picked up the camera. And I think this is, for me, one of the most interesting parts of this whole story, because it really challenges sort of, many of our expectations about how the scene worked and who was part of it. Born in Hungary in 1921, emigrating in 1934, first to Buenos Aires and then to São Paulo, Madalena Schwarz came to photography formally in 1966 at the age of 45. Originally born Madalena Mandel, she was part of a generation of Jewish women artists who fled Nazi persecution for South America. And that list would also include photographers like Greta Stern, Anne-Marie Heinrich, Hildegard Rosenthal, Alice Brill, and Giselle Freund, famous for taking revealing photos of Evita Peron that caused her to have to flee the country. Like Carmi, Schwarz was not particularly observant. Despite a heightened degree of anti-Semitism in Argentina and Brazilian society, she was able to more or less unhesitatingly enter into the rhythm of this new society, and like many Jewish expats, make a lasting imprint on it. In the years since stepping off of the Osaka Maru in the Argentine port of Santos, Schwarz went about making a home for her family in this new place. She ultimately married another Hungarian Jewish refugee, and together with her two small children made the difficult decision to leave Argentina for a small apartment in the storied Copan building in São Paulo, built by the legendary modernist architect Oscar Niemeyer and unveiled in 1966, the same year that she moved to the city. 38 stories tall, this urban landmark, known for its curved structure and 22 elevators, was a city within a city, with much of São Paulo's nightlife concentrated in the cinemas and the cafes kind of organized around it. The building was the center of intertwining worlds, where high met low culture, in an area bulging with art and experimentation. There was the Teatro Cultura Artística, classic movie houses like the Cine Bijou and the Sala Sergia Cardosa, the photo school where she would one day train, and Barney's Bar and the storied Gigetto restaurant, known for hosting cultural royalty from stage to screen. To make ends meet while learning yet another new language and blending in, she would run a laundry together with her husband on Rua Nestor Pesana, a few blocks away. Such is the story of an immigrant's life, like so many others, marked by uprootedness and transition and just getting by. But Schwartz's destiny was not yet written. Like Carmi's, it would change through a single solitary event when her son won a draw at a local theater and brought a camera into the family home. Julio showed little interest, but Madalena was immediately curious and signed up for lessons at the nearby Photo Cine Club, Bandeirante, one of the many spaces in her neighborhood where artists gathered. There, she would learn proper technique and forge lasting relationships with key figures in the São Paulo photography community. At first glance, it's hard to imagine Schwarz in the world of visual artists, not least the Brazilian cultural avant-garde, which was one of the two pillars of instruction at the photo club, alongside a more traditional emphasis on pictorialism. By all accounts, this unimposing woman was hardly the kind of person one might imagine moving in this scene. The writer, Ignacio Loyola Bandeira, remembered her cowering and shy behind the counter of her laundry, where she waited on customers with huge eyes, anxious. And yet somehow she found her footing, developed networks in the art, theater, and intellectual community, and began contributing to various exhibitions and shows with their innovative brand of photography. Bandeira invited her to do a portrait for Claudia magazine, where he was an editor, and by 1974, newly widowed, she subsequently earned an invitation from Pietro Maria Bardi to show her work exclusively at the São Paulo Museum of Art, a ticket into the mainstream. In the middle of that decade, she earned enough from her collaborations with the press and portrait photography to open a small studio in the same building where she lived. By her late 50s, she became a household name in the world of portraiture, ultimately producing over 16,000 negatives of film, now in the possession of the Instituto Moreira Salles, including images of writers, politicians, and artists, and the so-called transvestites, the term from the day, who frequented the bars and clubs around the Copan. Art critics and historians have struggled to piece together how exactly it came to be that Schwarz would take up the subject of cross-dressing at that point in her career. What made her move away from the commissioned pieces for publishing houses and fashion and news magazines for the underground world of transvestism and drag. There were few other examples in print to follow. Robert Mapplethorpe had yet to make his mark in New York. Carmi's photo book likely didn't travel beyond Italy. The magazine Transvestia, founded in 1960 by Los Angeles-based chemist Virginia Prince, and Drag, published in 1971 by the Queen's Liberation Front, which had formed a few years earlier in protest of the exclusionary politics of the Stonewall-era liberation movement, were likely not circulating anywhere near Schwarz and her community. And while the stories of the former GI, Christine Jorgensen, who traveled to Denmark for gender reassignment surgery, were the stuff of international attention in the 1950s onward, Brazil's scene was more informed by its own culture of gender nonconformism, with several examples trickling into the public sphere in both the Boulevard Press and early gay magazines. Several high-profile Brazilian performers made their way to Paris and West Berlin, where review shows sprang up in the post-war decades, and in 1977, the telenovela Espelho Mágico featured its first gender-fluid star. Amidst the raging dictatorship, Brazilian cinema featured numerous examples of so-called transformista, unlike across the border in Argentina, where there was not a single film including so-called transvestites. And the only time it was broached as a theme in 1975, the censor came down hard. Of course, gender nonconformism held pride of place a few weeks every year during Carnival season, where gender-fluid performance emerged out of the shadows and into the streets. Despite the appearance of toleration and gender play in carnival culture, the contemporary Brazilian gender and sexual order was far more complicated, with several different classes and categories of male to female trans people. There is the drag queen who dresses as a woman occasionally, cross-dressing at parties for fun. Then there are the transformista, similar to the drag queen, who come out mainly in carnival season as a national and international symbol of managed transgression. And then the travestiti, who worked in clubs as sex workers. They may hope to seek out hormones and body modification, although precarity and lack of access means that many occupied a more liminal space on the gender spectrum, their bodies especially fluid. According to Dora Silva Santana, travesti is a political position and a form of resistance by trans feminine women's bodies of historically mostly black and people of color from poor communities. To translate it simply as a trans woman not only misses the textures of difference, but it erases the social and economic conditions that form part of their struggle for existence. Transformista enjoyed a degree of protection within the twilight spaces of the gay scene, while for travesti in the city of Belo Horizonte, just dressing up as a woman could mean going to jail. In the reviews, many of the travesti entertained members of the military, protected by the boundaries of performance. But once they left the show houses, they too could be hounded by the police. Even efforts to perform gender reassignment surgery could garner attention, as with a high-profile incident in São Paulo, when a surgeon who performed gender reassignment surgery in 1971 was imprisoned for 2 years. Performing gender in a public way was fine, so long as it was a performance. Claiming gender as an identity could put one in peril. The rise of the dictatorship under the 1964 military government of Emilio Garastazzo Medici and the repressive measures against the LGBTQ community that followed, especially after passing the 1968 Institutional Act No. 5 and Decree 1077, which licensed the censoring of anything that challenged the sanctity of the family, were experienced in all quarters of the scene. These were dark times, with thousands of people rounded up as subversives. The Brazilian economy struggled as global oil prices skyrocketed, and economic policies designed to jumpstart the economy only further provoked the middle class, who increasingly turned on the government. The victory of the opposition Movimento Democrático Brasileiro in the 1974 elections raised the possibility that the dictatorship needed to consider reform. And over the course of the next few years, with more student and worker strikes and widespread malaise, the military set forth on a policy of slow and gradual return to democracy. Activists began to trickle back from exile, and feminist, worker, and protean gay rights groups started drawing on the lessons learned from contacts abroad to formalize a movement. Despite these early successes in trans visibility, police inquiry, censorship, and the policing of public morality remained commonplace until the end of the dictatorship in 1985, and a new constitution recognized formal equality for gays and lesbians in 1988. These distinctions make Schwarz's decision to photograph the trans folks of her neighborhood even more interesting, and help us understand her choice to invite people back to her apartment, where she would shoot them in the controlled space of an unfinished room that also served as her home studio. Far from the pomp and circumstance of the tourist or carnival scene where trans worlds were staged in living color, Schwarz preferred intimate, artistic portraits in black and white. Her choice of portrait photography was more than merely aesthetic. As Marco Antonio Teixeira Gonçalves puts it, drawing on photography theory on the place of portraiture in theories of representation, it allowed her to use the camera to capture the essence of her sitting subject, making the invisible visible and material. The portrait, one of the hardest genres of photography, fixes a moment in time, or in visual anthropologist Elizabeth Edwards' words, it seizes a moment from the flow and process of existence and gives an intensity of the moment. To some extent, this goes beyond the desires of the maker, an effect of the uniqueness of image capture and its materialization on the page. But Schwarz's role was not insignificant. She created the conditions for these acts of representation and discovery, in, like Carmi, building bonds of trust and intimacy with those who posed with her, and crucially, in showcasing these bodies in acts of construction at the hands of the performers themselves. And in this sense, though it isn't ever explicitly stated in her archive, the absent presence of her own experience of violence inevitably plays a role. But here too, photography itself was central. We often think of portrait photography as singularly focused on the face, frozen and static. It's true that the face is the embodiment of subjectivity, what makes us unique and original. But what a body does is also part of that uniqueness, an extension of the inner qualities of being, the inner self externalized, made visible in public. Portraits are both mimetic and real. They simultaneously represent the person being photographed, and they manifest the ethereal, that mystical essence of the soul, of character, of virtues in the sitter. The sitting subject donates some aspect of their image, and the photography animates it within the frame. Portrait photography is also a social act, what the French sociologist Bourdieu called a sociogram, a visual record of social roles and relations. And as these relations take place in particular moments in time, these enactments of sense and sensibility, of values and emotions are bound and connected to space and place. Images are windows into the moment in which they are made, but their meaning changes as they move from hand to hand into different relationships of viewing, touch, observation, and display. Portraits are also often one of sequences of images selected by their maker as representing that which they hope to capture. For her part, Schwarz liked to begin a photo shoot without actually loading her camera. According to her son, sometimes she would shoot up to 4 reels of imaginary pictures. She would test out angles and lighting, while also encouraging the subject or subjects, and she'd often photograph people in pairs, like you see here. She'd encourage them to settle into themselves, to allow themselves to be captured by the lens. This unconventional method cut through the artifice of staged performance, while simultaneously making the camera the mediator between the photographer and the photographed. Unlike the posed and staged photographs of other photographers, there's a messiness to the fluidity of Schwarz's images, however planned. We see this in a variety of sequences of Danton from 1970 and again in 1973. A hairdresser from the neighborhood, Danton is often seen posed in a corner of Schwarz's apartment, seated on a chair, naked or near naked, sometimes in makeup and wig, other times clear-faced. A wrinkled white sheet draped over the floor. We see Schwarz's drapes. We see her windows. We even see her cat sleeping in the background, obfuscated ever so slightly by Danton's large-heeled silver or gold platform shoe. In some of the photos, there's another figure in the background, sometimes just a wash of hair and movement, blurred. Other times seated in parallel to Danton, with two faces the focus of attention. Some series feature Danton with their face made up like a mask, while in others they are featured entirely without adornment. Other photo series from her studio are deliberately piquant. In one set against a black screen and floor, the photo series labeled Unidentified Person 1970s suggests that Schwarz was unafraid of testing the limits of accessibility. Over the course of 7 portraits, we see a stunning woman in a cat pose, seated on the ground, her silky dress skirt circling her torso as she stares back at the lens. We notice her beautifully feathered hair and glistening, plump lips. Her neck and wrist are bedecked with shimmering chains of silver and gold. We can't know which. And in one photo, she sits seated, her head back slightly, her bosom cradled in what appears to be a corset. With each portrait, her body is more and more revealed, until finally we encounter her seated, cradling a porcelain doll, completely naked. In one photo, positioned slightly to the left of the center of the frame, she brings the doll's mouth to her breast, to nurse at her plump breast, while the camera captures the contradictions of the pose, including her pubic hair and her penis. There is both angularity and softness in this photograph, the doll's articulated limbs mirroring the sitting subject's thighs and calf. In another, she cradles the doll in child's pose, with obvious parallels between the doll's features and her own. But the most striking of them all sees the subject standing, legs akimbo, this time fully centered. With her right arm, she holds the doll naturally. With her right hand, she looks at it through as though she's preparing to drag on a cigarette, her body's curves and attributes on full display. This photo is anything but coy. It takes its meaning from the mix of danger and delight, the soft suppleness of skin, mixed with a hint of muscularity, tempting the viewer with the eroticism of this art. In laying claim to the space of one's freedom and pleasure, it mounts a direct challenge to the authoritarianism governing Brazil, suggesting that for some of its citizens, there may in fact be an alternative notion of being and time than the ones dictated by the regime. There are other series in the Schwarz collection, the subject of a 2021 retrospective collaboration between cultural institutions in Buenos Aires and São Paulo. Not all of her images are studio portraits. She also trained her lens on members of the actors associated with the international avant-garde cabaret group C. Croquette, who took the Brazilian stage by storm in the 70s. The name for the troupe is deliberately ironic. C meant to be the in English, and croquette a reference to cheap Brazilian street food. The writing of it, with double TT, calls for it to be pronounced in Portuguese with a French accent. So both names are in a sense impersonating a foreign word, one with English accent and the other with a French accent, suggesting that to be a foreigner has a better value, maybe, than being local. As slang, this word for a piece of fried meat dough, meat-filled dough, apparently held double meaning as well, as a reference to the phallus, given the Brazilian penchant for double meanings with sexual connotation. This is where we all wish we spoke Portuguese or traveled to Brazil to actually live through these really interesting double entendres. So the joke is, in trying to make cheap fried dough sound elegant, even if it's a common dish. The troupe itself was made up of 13 gay men who presented a subversive, finely choreographed set of performance as critique under the mantra of assumed female characters. Their jaunty way of poking fun at the dictatorship and elite society earned them a significant following at home and abroad. Under the shroud of performance, they managed to avoid the censor, though they did see fit to leave Brazil for 2 years in 1974 for a European tour at the height of repression. Not only did they work together, but they lived together as a kind of experiment in art meets life. Although Z Croquette did not explicitly portray transvestites or transsexuality on stage, their obvious androgyny and send-up of the imperfections of masculinity and femininity clearly begged audiences to consider what it meant to think about body norms beyond hard and fast dichotomies of male and female. Transing gender, as historian Jen Mannion called it, allowed them to deploy these elaborate parodies to foreground the instability of the regime through the mutability of gender itself. Schwarz's photos extend the conversation around gender performance back into the makeup room, where her portraits of Claudio Tovar, Roberto, and Paulette showcase the work that went into staging and restaging gender. Whereas her studio portraits reflect the minimalism of empty space, the dressing room images are choked with adornment. There are feathers, lamps, mirrors, sparkles, and sequins, boas, and wigs. Taped to the mirror's edge are the curled corners of other images from friends, from lovers, and fans, while little pots of creams and gels and brushes sit dutifully on the dressing table, waiting to be used. Most striking of all is the use of contrast. Schwarz, steeped in the use of light and darkness to convey mood, plays with the photograph's construction. In these photos, the viewer's eye is drawn obligatorily to the sitting subject as the image's focal point, but it can't help but dart around, pushed along by the jumble of textures and contrasts of all that is inhabiting the frame. Sometimes the eye surprises itself, like when it narrows around Paulette's choker, necklace, and gem, sitting atop of her Adam's apple, her hairy bare chest on full display. As we linger over these conflicting markers of gender, we're caught up staring by Carolinos, gazing back at us over Paulette's right shoulder. The theatricality of the individual scenes, the self-masking and adornment and artifice, denaturalizes gender, not just as a performance, but as a tangible thing, a set of practices, an application of paint, the way one holds a glance, a gesture, a look, a mask perched atop one's head, as here with the special guest. And I don't know if you can tell who the special guest is meant to be, but he's someone, maybe he wouldn't have imagined himself in a cabaret act, and it's supposed to be, of course, Hitler. It's what the kids say is very meta. That's what I'm told. Schwarz begs the viewer to witness the actors as fashioning themselves out of the collective materials at culture's disposal. As Martin de Moro-Rukowski points out in his contribution to the exhibition catalog, Schwarz's photos are extraordinary for a variety of reasons. One, they are the work of immigrant women photographers in a male-dominated art, review, and gay scene. More importantly, they initiate a conversation around gender, performance, camp, and desire that predates Esther Newton's iconoclastic study of female impersonators, first published in 1979, which would go on to inspire the work of science in the field of queer theory, including Judith Butler and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, whose work would be so signature to all that came next. But I would go one step further still. As a Jewish woman photographer in Latin America and a refugee, in a time of military overthrow, neo-fascist dictatorship, and ever-present danger, Madalena Schwarz used her camera to make visible the social contradictions of her world. This wasn't just an art practice. In an age of ongoing dictatorship, showcasing gender and sexual freedom was existential. Viewed against her other, more well-known portraits of the period, and this is yet another of Hitler's Z Croquette, we're very interested in using him as a device. Viewed against her other, more well-known portraits of the period, like the image of the Afro-Brazilian singer Clementina de Jesus, or Mãe Menina de Gantois, the granddaughter of slaves and practitioner of candomblé, a mixture of Afro-Brazilian religious practices and Catholicism, it's certain that Schwarz was taken by the theme of social marginalization, and lest we forget, in a place like Brazil, race played a central part. At the same time, her use of the camera was anything but vampiric. Schwarz's photography and the intimacy she cultivated with trans people and androgyne served as a visual meditation on the place of race, ethnicity, and colonialism in contemporary Brazilian identity. On some level, it seems fitting that Schwarz would be taken by this theme in her practice. To be Jewish in Brazil was to inhabit an existential paradox. After years of limited immigration in 1937, Getúlio Vargas welcomed Jews to help build his dictatorial regime, Estado Novo. Although a safe haven for refugees like Schwarz, there as elsewhere, anti-Semitism formed part of everyday life. To survive in Brazil as a Jew often meant social and cultural compromise, according to the Brazilian principle of cordialidade, the oft-romanticized term for cordiality and intimacy among cultural and ethnic difference. This vision of racial and ethnic harmony is a fiction, of course, born on the back of generations of anti-Black violence that only recently has become the subject of academic scrutiny. Brazilian anthropologist João Costas Vargas has gone so far as to say that race manifests in all sorts of subtle yet no less central ways, from the more obvious forms of spatial segregation in the major cities and the racist structure of the criminal justice system to over 134 Brazilian terms for racial difference, which Jaime Amparo Alves argues is a way to circumvent speaking about race directly. If we think of trans not as an identity category, but as a form of instability, crossings, leakages, and slips of all sorts, we may view Schwarz's images of differently racialized actors, hairdressers, dancers, and artists as offering up vestiges of Brazil's colonial past in an equally fraught and imperfect authoritarian present. Although she took up this theme more explicitly in her work on Afro-Brazilian youth in the northeast parts of the country, there's no getting around the fact that she was also the only Brazilian woman image maker to visualize this subject photographically. Her art constructs a social world that was not just inclusive, but helped make visible the social transformation and acceptance of diversely gendered and racialized bodies themselves, beyond the dictates of the state, beyond bourgeois morality, gender norms in the family, even as it was made possible in part because of her own life that met some of these dictates. Her capturing of the performance of gender is, as Diana Taylor calls it, a politics of other means, a place between archive and repertoire, a space that tells stories, a product of experiences, personal intimate memories, historical traumas, socio-political crises, and formative spaces. Schwarz worked in kinship and solidarity with her sitting subjects across their shared differences. The result is an archive of fungibility, of humanity, and fundamental opposition to the authoritarianism that marked the world in which she and the people she photographed operated as outsiders to different degrees. These unruly visions, as NYU professor Gayatri Gopinath has argued, do important work in mapping out a long-standing and vibrant history of queer and trans life worlds, brought into view through the solidarities and struggles, in this case, of Jewish photographers whose experience of fleeing racist violence allowed them ways of drawing on their own experience to stand adjacent to their subjects, humanizing them and their lives in the process. Thank you.